I'm continuing to ignore that people think it's wrong to present the gathering of the berries rather than the complete um, carton of berries. I'm continuing to go into the points of confusion where some thought might come to its fruition. The question I want to ask, our impending program of Heideggerian historicism, of reaching Heidegger's thought, brings us to this question of nature, east and west. Um, I'm asking the question now, posing the question to myself now, is Zizek even part of the combined unity of this question? Can we say Zizek is a rightist or leftist, more progressive or more conservative with regard to this question, or has he even entered into the ground of this question at all? If we take his common example, which he gives ad infinitum, of Niels Bohr, um, uh, with regard to his idea of ideology, which seems to have something to do with the unconscious. It's sort of like they're so much this way that they're unconscious that they're this way. That seems to, in a way, sum up his peculiar notion of ideology, which can be differentiated from other notions of ideology, such as the notion that ideologies are explicit doctrines which are based on the fact value distinction, where we try to anchor things in the so-called facts in the and we go from the facts to values, and then we try to say these values are anchored in the facts, which would be explicit. But in Zizek's example of, he gives many examples, one example being Niels Bohr saying, I've heard that the horseshoe, hanging up the horseshoe works whether you believe in it or not. Um, Taken from the Nietzschean perspective, I think this can be flipped around, and one can say, I heard that modern mathematical physics still operates whether one believes in it or not. So, in other words, Nietzsche says, why science? For Nietzsche, science is this sort of unconscious operation of an ideology. It's not truth in the full sense, but it still seems to operate for the ordinary citizens' understanding from their Schwerpunkt, whether or not they really believe in it. They know that it still functions, it still works, there'll still be success in it, whether they believe in it or not. So the point I want to get at is, in this example, what is Zizek presupposing here? He's presupposing that the idea of the horseshoe being hung up is about causality, and it's about causality in a specific modern sense, which is this gets us into the historicist idea of whether the past is yet past or not. Was this idea of causality always available? And then the deeper question, was it always, as it were, ontologically the case, but not yet discovered? So it seems like Niels Bohr is saying it's still going to operate whether or not I believe in it. So why is this ideology? If it's true, then it's just true. It's just the same thing as saying, well, I don't really understand modern mathematical physics, but I know that it operates even if I don't understand it. I don't really believe in it, but it's still working. So I know that it still works because they're supposed laws uh, of the so-called natural world, which is also a very recent notion in the way it's used to mean the external world, where everything is supposed to be external because supposedly it came to pass that the brain, which is one external thing alongside other things, is somehow, even though it makes no sense, we're meant to believe that the brain is the basis for all the other things in the external world. One object among others, the brain, is the cause of all the other objects existing for us as representations of whatever it is that sends signals which excite the brain. So we have here, again, this sort of ideological matrix, which really makes no sense, but then we believe in it, and then therefore it works anyway, even though, or we don't believe in it, but we somehow, it works anyway. So Zizek really basing his beginning point on the idea of causality. And where does that come from? So in Kant, we can see where this idea of the Newtonian mathematical causality, which Newton's first law is basically a sort of modified repeat of Galileo's inertial frame of reference theory, which, if one look at it strictly speaking, is false because there's no actual pure vacuum, but it's nonetheless said as though it were a matter of what in the analytical philosophy department would be called ontological questions about, which brings us into a kind of circle, questions about so-called physical facts, which basically means external facts rather than what's happening in dreams or imaginings. Here, the reason that so the issue is that around Kant's time, and a little while later, especially in Schopenhauer's habilitation or thesis, it's finally worked out very clearly that when we make logical inferences, I have a tree is a living thing, in this old syllogistic way. I have a tree is a living thing. Well, say we mix it up a little bit. I see before me a large tree. I know that trees grow, and therefore I can deduce from that this must have been at one time been smaller. This form of logical causation was let's say the tradition going back 2,500 years or so was at great pains to finally extract that half of it, the logical half, from the so-called external physical nature, quote unquote. But it's not quote unquote because we really believe it, or we don't believe it, but we think it functions. The so-called physical nature and its causality, which is sometimes glossed as the efficient causality, which is I don't want to go into that now, but that's wrong. Like for connecting it to Aristotle, that's unless that's a correction to Aristotle. This is some small part of one of the four Aristotelian questions of why. So that's where we can show this more starkly. So what is the kind of question that Zizek's asking here with the Niels Bohr question to try to we're already confused ourselves a little with this super subtle incursion of ideas from different time periods. How so far was it available, the basic idea of causality, to Socrates, for instance? But let's not go into that immediately. Let's just say, what was Socrates actually asking? He was asking about opinions. So if somebody has an opinion and they keep insisting that they have the truth, and then we find out when we kind of probe into it, the person that has it, first of all, they turn out to be a kind of thumos type political agent who becomes red hot with anger or scorn at being shown out to not really know what they're talking about. But the long and short of it is they're not in possession of the truth. In Plato and in Socrates, the basic sense of causality is simply the why, which links only to ordinary dealings, which is not linked to this sort of gray which pours out into the cosmic gray of causality, which goes to the extreme to a principle of the uniformity of nature with regards to causality, but it's rather more like questions like, there's a chair here, how to get here? Well, someone must have put it here. And it's just it's empirical in this very modest sense. It's not a theory of causality in any explicit sense, and certainly not in this sense that I heard that the horseshoe functions anyway. It's going to work anyway. It's going to work causally anyway, even if I don't believe in it. Well, that's perfectly rational if it's really true that the physics works anyway, whether you believe in it or not. The cheetah is following the laws of physics, whether it knows anything about it or not, and this can be fully demonstrated by the experts. And of course, they do give such expert demonstrations daily, or at least while the universities were still open before COVID. But if Zizek is assuming that there's a kind of tacit assumption that some kind of idea of causality in this sense is the basic sense of nature, then we can see that in Socrates, this is not assumed at all. What the questions are about is, do you have some kind of opinion about, for instance, and to take the whole subject matter of the politeia, you think that justice is giving to each one what they're owed, but I can demonstrate to you that there's cases where you don't believe that, and your own opinions violate that belief. Because do you really believe that when a man is, when his whole will is set on smashing the head open of someone and throwing them down into a well, that we should let them go? We should give them leave to go do that. We should give them the, let's say they lent us their hammer to do some hammering, and now they want the hammer to go bash the skull of this person open. Should we give them the hammer? And then you say, well, maybe not. And there's these questions of opinion and so on. Where is there in that causality in this sense? Where is there in this early ideology of Plato and Socrates, this same idea of the beginning point is all about causality in the efficacious sense? But let me make this more clear. The point is that what really happens is when people say things like, it's not that people say, I don't believe in it, but it still functions. It's really that people just subscribe to opinions. They don't actually care in the more basic sense, in the sense that Socrates is looking at whether their opinion leads to the best causal outcome, to success, etc. What they really care about is the subscription to a certain opinion which they've been born into. So, like, for instance, if I have a case of, Zizek also gives the cases of people act as though democracy, they believed in democracy, one vote, one man, but they really know that one vote is totally inefficacious, but they still like to say the vote is preservative of all other rights, and they like the whole thing about it, but they know that it's not true. And somehow this is also an example of ideology. But what would that be from the Socratic point of view? It would really be subscription to an opinion without reference to what the causal result is. The base issue from the Socratic point of view is having that opinion and not wanting to be budged from it. It's not this question of the causal result of I don't believe in it, but I heard it's still going to causally play out that way, even if I don't believe in it. So is Zizek starting from a notion of nature which is totally absorbed in the idea of the causal outlay, where we then have these questions of determinism versus the question of the will, or the question of fate, or some other questions, or is it that this is simply a form this idea of causality itself, like Nietzsche says, is something we've inherited at this moment in history, and why this notion of causality, why this particular notion. Um, this we can look at in more particular detail. Um, I'll try to go into it in more particular detail, in more sharp detail, over the case of what really happens with Kant and causality, and why has causality become so sharp? I mean, it's clear on first blush that with the mathematical physics of Newton, then Kant had this problem of how to save the dignity of man, because people prefer to say that I'm responsible for my own acts, or Kant actually, Zizek usually attributes this to Hegel somehow, but it's originally the ursprung of Kant, which is to say that the whole point of the Kantian theory is that man will not be really man unless he's able to make free actions, which is to say he's not determined by his causal past. He's not determined by the so-called historical disadvantages, and therefore Zizek goes on a lot about these liberals are trying to attribute to the minorities the historical disadvantages, and therefore they make them less of a human being, less of a free agent. And you can see this kind of point of division, for instance, with the where, for instance, the Catholics want to say that homosexuality is a kind of something like an illness, and therefore, but then if you had somebody like was the codebreaker Turing or somebody like that who was put to death, or not put to death, but he was, I think, chemically castrated, and then through the side effects, he then committed suicide. Because still after the war in Britain, being a homosexual was against the laws. But the point would be that then the homosexual or the minority would say, no, my acts are based on my own autonomous choice. They're not an illness, therefore you can't, therefore to attribute them to historical causes, to my upbringing, to what the parents did to me, or this or that, is to diminish my importance as a human being. Kant still thinks there's one right rational real is going to be discovered, so then everyone will find their human dignity by willing this right way of doing things. This too seems to be in the background of Zizek's thinking, and taken as a tacit presupposition for all his thinking, and he's as though he were simply participating in that moment of history and not casting himself outside of it. There's a great deal more to go into there. We must remember also another part of that would be that for Kant, there's no notion of the other big subject, which is large, must be tackled in order to get to Heidegger, is that idealism has largely been reread in the current understanding of idealism has been cast over Kant, cast over George Berkeley, and even cast over Nietzsche, I would say, such that we have such a ridiculous vision of what idealism means, and what the representational thinking means, that we can't quite access these thinkers properly. I make one simple, more modest, and maybe more clear example of one of the basic parts of this theme of whether we're dealing with people that are open to historical consciousness or not, would be just such a simple theme as, for instance, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the deposed kings and such potentates argued that here we have this brutish Corsican nobody, and he's dislodged us from our hereditary rights as sovereigns, and this is illegitimate. So this, at that moment, the notion of of legitimacy became a subject of discussion within the high point of history. Um, these high historical acts of political acts, history understood without qualification as the political history, and then but now we talk about the legitimacy of the ancient Persians, the legitimacy of the ancient Babylonians, and so on. So then the question arises, are we being ahistorical in doing that, or is it rather that there was always a consciousness of that, but it was only here given a name and thematized and become part of the academic apparatus of examining things? So that can have some of the cases will be clearer where we can see people were aware of that theme, but they didn't give it that name. Other cases, it will be that theme simply didn't exist. Possibly that's the case with the Chinese looking at the logic text at the Port Royal logic and originally saying, no, there's nothing like this in China, but later on projecting it back. Other such cases. This is part and parcel of the sort of, I would call it the conservative